Good morning, Bahamaland. Good morning yet again. I'm Fayne Thompson with another show to share with you about the issues which impact your life. Today I'm going to refer to myself as the pundit because we're going to do some punditing. That's talking. Simply means that we're going to be talking about some things which are topical. And today, front and center, is the whole conversation about the doctor strike, union issues, minimum wage, the future for the people of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Now, you know the time of our show. We go from about 11 until 12. We're going to keep it like that until such time as we become, as we make some other decisions. But we're here today, as per usual, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, to talk to you, the Bahamian people, about things that you will not hear in the mainstream media. We will give a point of view which is censored in the mainstream media. You will hear about issues which very few commercial business outlets the commercial outlets, the news media commercial outlets will not hear. And you sure as hell you're not going to hear it on ZNS. In fact, if anything, it's going to be blockaded from ZNS. But today it's going to be important because I want to share with you a part of your history and a part of my history. And I'm going to begin at a point which hopefully will make sense at the end of the day. We will begin with a history of the labor movement in the Bahamas. We'll go through recent developments, and at the very end, we're going to focus on what's been going on of recent vintage in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. We know that the doctors are on strike. We know that the Bahamas Public Services Union had issues that supposedly were settled. It seems to be the year of discontent from the opening of this year, and this is really no fault, I guess, of the government. These are long-standing issues, but they sit at the table, so they're the ones who carry the ball to resolve these issues. So from that point of view, we're going to be looking at labor matters in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas and moving forward. Because as much as people do not understand, automation is going to be the end or the beginning of a new day in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. But what is automation all about? Automation is about transferring things to provide the same services that human beings provided. So digitization and automation are not necessarily manna from on high. They could very well mean the end of the labor movement as we know it. And what happens in those circumstances? On Friday, we're going to go into much greater detail about that. Today, I'm going to focus on the first part of the show. We're going to call it a focus today on labor, parts 1 and part 2. And this is going to be part 1 of that particular show. And we begin by talking about the general strike of 1958. It is always important to understand your past, to chart a way for the future, that you understand your past. There's one group of people who are very, very adamant about that. They're the Jews. They understand the importance of history because in their view and in their opinion, and this applies to black people too, Chinese and all those around the world, if you forget where you come from, you have a chance. There's a likelihood that you'll repeat the mistakes of the past. We are seeing today, as we move into the 21st century in earnest, a clear shift by business houses to automate their workplaces. So much so that if you walk into Royal Bank now, a place which used to be buzzing and busy with a bunch of people, it's now shrunken in terms of the number you see of people behind the desk. The emphasis now is on providing a digital response to the needs of their customers. Now that means something, because that is a trend which is not just taking place in the field of digitization and automation. It's taking place across the world. The Bahamas is not free from this particular development, but the question is how does the Bahamas intend to deal with it as it unfolds and it begins to gallop and assume a much more greater significance. We're going to be talking about that today. And I'm going to go back into history. Because this all started somewhere. You see, when I see working people out there struggling, I always remember that but for the struggle of working Bahamians, like the doctors, like the teachers, like the workers at BPSU, like workers in the private sector, and so forth, but for their sacrifice, the Bahamas would not be what it is today. In 1958, we had a general strike. And some say that was the making of the modern Bahamas. The key laborers of the time are no longer with us. There was Sir Clifford Darling. Well, I'm not going to use the foolishness. There were Clifford Darling and, of course, Mr. Randolph Fox, both of whom are now deceased. Mr. Fox's book, The Faith That Moved the Mountain, gives his personal history and his personal perspective as a leader of the Bahamas Federation of Labor as to the events which unfolded and transpired just before the 1960s. The 1960s were an interesting period. Across the world, there were movements being led to change the world. The cry was self-determination, equality, and freedom. And the Bahamas got swept up into that same mood like every other country. And Randall Fox, in his book and I quote, "The Faith That Moved the Mountain," gives his personal account as to what was going on specifically in the Bahamas at that time, and more specifically, what was happening to labor. Clifford Darling's book is also another good book. That book is known as A Bahamian Life Story, and that provides much of the background necessary to understand and appreciate what catalyzed, what caused the taxi union to take the position that it took in 1958 to go on strike. His account includes many communications from colonial authorities and, of course, many newspaper reports. I recommend that you read it, because when you tell your children the story about the working Bahamas, that is the story that you must tell. So in this part A of a two-part series, I'm going to focus on labor, and we're going to bring the story home later on during the show, and on Friday we will complete the process. It's a big process, but these shows are important from an historical point of view for you to turn back to if you want to answer some questions about where we came from. Because you see, anyone who stands against the doctors today, something wrong with their heads. Anyone who stands against genuine labor demands in this country to achieve and improve upon the lifestyles of the Bahamian people, something wrong with their heads. And I'm going to show you why. Now, in that time, let me put into context. The PLP had been formed. And ladies and gentlemen, please do not confuse me today. I hold no brief for the PLP. I have no brief for the FNM. I have no brief for the DNA. In many ways, I'm going to be an historian today. So I'm going to tell us a history as to how we got where we are. Involved in that story is a story and the role played by the Progressive Liberal Party. At that time, the PLP had just been formed. And according to a particular article at the time in the London Daily Mail, it was caught up in the throes of election upon election to fight for the rights of Bahamians, white and black. But we know that at that particular time, the focus of the PLP was to provide the form of a sense of equality so that black Bahamians and not so black Bahamians, Bahamians who were not advantaged, and poor white Bahamians could achieve a better piece of the pie, otherwise known as the so-called square deal. In an interview at that time, Randall Fox said that the progressive movement was fully united in the mid-1950s. Pindling, he said, took care of the political arm, and I took care of the labor arm. Bread and butter economics. So LO became the leader of the PLP, and I became the leader of the labor movement. Now that is in fact true. That's an historical fact. By 1958, the classic battle lines were drawn between an unyielding authoritarian regime controlled by a monopolistic business elite who were white and the majority of deprived Bahamians who yearned for democracy, who were black. 50 years on, the Bahamas became the playground of the Western world. Tourism became the modus operandi of the way in which we became great. It is fair to say that we created a tourist product which was second to none, and it superseded the Caribbean, especially around the time the Cuba closed, which was in 1962. For anyone who understands the history of the Bahamas, you must understand the background of that history. The history was, again, couched by demands for majority rule, self-determination across the world by brown and black and some white people in certain parts of the world against the former colonial countries like Britain, Germany, etc., etc., etc. It was an important time. It was an important time. But it was also a time when Cuba had a revolution in 1959. Let me make sure I get it right. Led by essentially Fidel Castro, who at the time was not a communist, but once he won, he embraced the support of the Soviet Union. He became a Marxist-Leninist. And his particular transformation was important because once he embraced the politics of the Soviet Union at the time, Russia, otherwise known as the Soviet Union at that time, he was literally shunned by the Americans. He was shunned by countries in the Western world, and that became the reason why an embargo was imposed upon Cuba by the United States government. It's important to know that background, because against that particular background, Cuba shut down. Cuba shut down. Now, why is the shutting down of Cuba so important? The shutting down of Cuba was important because when Cuba shut down, a huge part of its tourist market, including all the unsavory types like Meyer Lansky, all the mafiosi fellas, all of them shifted their emphasis to the Bahamas. That's a fact, for which there is very little dispute. That tourism, as they knew it in Cuba, died, and tourism, which was the new thing in the Bahamas as we knew it, took off in the Bahamas like a jet. In or about the 1950s, late 1950s, early 1960s. Essentially presided over by a man known as, well, two men. One, Roland Simonet, and the other, one, Stafford Sands. Now, all of this is important because in this context, many demands were being made by that newborn expression of democracy, which is being led by people like Randall Fox. that newborn expression of democracy was in many ways evidenced by people who were leading the movement. Pinling was one. Again, the leader of the Progressive Liberal Party at the time. Milo Butler was there. Miriam Ingram. All the great women who stood by, etc., etc., etc. And all of them who stood by and fought for a better day. It was important that we put all of that into the mix because as a result of them coming together, the labor movement also was a key and component part of it, led by, at the time, Mr. Clifford Darling. And when we talk about the labor movement, we're talking about the taxi union. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about the labor movement in the 50s and 60s, and we're talking specifically about the role to be played by a man known as Clifford Darling. Now, at that time, I remember now, Bahamians are agitating for a better life. They want their piece of the pie, so to speak. But at the time, as the newspaper report suggested, there was a cadre, a cabal, a very selfish, greedy Bay Street merchants who essentially were holding the country hostage under their control. So, for example, the development and the various tourist boards, even though they were not paid members of parliament, they were getting their cheddar, they were getting their cheese by virtue of the fact that being members of parliament, they controlled the country. They didn't need to be paid as ministers or whatever, and they controlled the country to their advantage using various boards and so forth, which helped them to run the country. So a bevy of tour companies had set up to do service in the Bahamas, and visitors began to visit the Bahamas, and they were brought in, to visit the Bahamas as our tourist industry exploded. Remember now, against a very, very important background, which included the development of our tourist industry, the tour industry began to take off. Bahamas Holidays, Dan Knowles was one that we've heard about. Howard Johnson Tours, Play Tours, Nassau Tours, etc., etc., etc. Philip Brown Tours. Some of these were the tour companies that began to operate in the Bahamas. But things were not as good as they should have been because Bay Street sought to maintain a stranglehold on an industry which was clearly expanding at a time when this expansion was taking place. When demands for inclusion were more common, what we began to see was an attempt by one particular businessman, otherwise known as one particular businessman. He sought to bring on a taxi business, which literally would wipe out the nascent, the newborn industry which was developing. By means of bribery, intimidation, and the restriction of the franchise, that is to say, who could have a tour company, persons were refused the right to ply their businesses on Bay Street and up and down and around the country. As another London newspaper at the time quoted Clifford Darling, they said, and I quote, "The American tourists dominated the Bahamian Islands, representing the most Gilbertian picture in the empire. The trouble is the absence of any genuine democracy. As a consequence, the majority of members are elected by the business community, which uses its political power for its own commercial ends." The PLP, being the dominant political party, or the emerging party at that time, presented to the development boards the view that the development boards, which were being used to maintain a strict control over this industry, were really only benefiting a small number of Bahamians. That became the complaint of that time. Of course, led by Mr. Pinling, and of course, agitated upon by Randolph Fox. And under the leadership of Stafford Sands, there was a tremendous resistance to changing the so-called structure, to widen the scope within which persons other than themselves can enjoy a piece of the pie. Again, you're not going to hear this story on ZNS. Again, you're not going to hear this story in the commercial media because they don't want to tell you the truth about the way in which this country was born. Now, the reason why what I do is going to be so important is because I'm going to lay it out to you. And then I'm going to invite you to respond. So we're going to be looking for comments sometime during this A and B part, two-part show to see how you feel about some of our views. So the opening up of the Nassau International Airport in 1957 was pivotal. It was pivotal because of what it represented. A group of major hotels proposed to sign an exclusive agreement with the airport, set up by Bobby Simonette, the son of the government leader Rollo Simonette, to, as it were, control the industry. It is a fact that the meter taxi cab is owned and directed by a family with considerable basic interests and connections, was said and commented upon. Thus, the question was, who was going to get a piece of this action? Because again, most times when people go to the streets, and this is why it's going to be so important to support our doctors and support Bahamian workers when they agitate. Most times when they go to the street for bread and butter issues. A lot of people believe that the reason why there was a general strike in 1958 was that because black people were demonstrating against the injustices of the white minority government. Well, the answer is yes and no. But the predominant issue, and even the dominant issue, and even Mr. Clifford Darling says this, was that the action was directed at demanding that all of us should take part in the taxi business, in the ground transportation business. And he had this to say: it was a business deal. And I quote Mr. Clifford Darling, all of us were ready to go to jail if that is what it took. That is to say, if we did not get a piece of this business, all of us were prepared to go to jail. So they blockaded the street. After the police failed to break the blockade, the authorities gave way, and 2 months later, a truce was declared to hammer out a long-term settlement. A lot of people do not know that the reason for the so-called general strike of 1958 had a lot to do with the times and the changing economic dynamic in the country. Although agreement was eventually reached, the talks deadlocked over a single issue. The tour companies rejected a call-up system to transport surplus visitors, preferring to use taxis of their own choice. And then they tried to reopen points that had already been agreed. That set the stage for a new confrontation, and the taxi union called on their members for support. So it was as a result of the toing and froing of the argument as to how they were going to share this business with the opening up of National International Airport that caused the so-called fracture in our society, resulting in what became known as a general strike. Let me continue. At an overflow meeting on Wolf Road in the evening of Sunday, January the 12th, 1958, Randolph Fox brought a motion that was unanimously carried by the Bahamas Federation of Labor, which, and I quote, should call a general strike to aid the taxi unions and to dramatize the right of all Bahamians for greater dignity and self-respect on the job site through decent wages and better working conditions. So you see what is happening is that an economic call to fairness and to fair play now was widened and began to expand to include wider issues, bread and butter issues about the way in which Bahamian society was ordered. This time, politicians got involved. Randolph Fox would see the emergence of Mr. Pilling. Mr. Pilling and Randolph Fox on the 7th of January 13th, 1958, had planned a series of agitation. Yes, attempts at agitation to more generally bring the Bahamian people up to speed. On that particular day, Pilling and Fox entered the Emerald Beach Hotel, rested their hands on the shoulder of Saul Campbell, a chief shop steward of the Hotel Workers Union, and whispered the word "now." What would happen next was totally and completely unanticipated. This password echoed throughout the length and breadth of New Providence, and the results were that hundreds of hotel and electricity workers, garbage collectors, construction workers, longshoremen, civil service, airline and restaurant staff walked off their jobs to the slogan, "Not a sweat." Not a sweat. Bay Street shops were boycotted, and within days the hotels closed and the city came to a standstill. The governor called for a warship, and British troops arrived from Jamaica to reinforce the 300 policemen whose loyalty could not be guaranteed. The times were changing. The power structure, and I quote Clifford Darling, the power structure did not see that the strike was something that the people were ready for and did not have to be forced into. Clifford Darling continued, "I believe that everyone in every sector had finally had enough and wanted things to change." In Randolph Fox's words, we knew what we were witnessing. We were witnessing the birth of a new Bahamian experience, a new working Bahamian with other Bahamians to follow. And although the Tribune editor, we knew how conservative he could have been, he uttered these words, Etienne Dupuche at the time: "The tragedy of it is that all this unnatural hatred has been produced by the greed and avarice of a few men in the community." That was Etienne Dupuche at the time. The strikers received moral support from the AFL, CIO. People don't know how wide the stretch of Randolph Fox actually was at that time. The AFL, CIO. From the Jamaican chief minister at the time, because Jamaica was not independent at the time, Norman Manley. Also, the strikers also received support from various other groups in the United States. On January 30th of 1958, the governor promised to set up a transport authority to resolve the dispute. And despite the lack of an immediate victory, they finally, at a later date, came to an agreement as to the issues. According to Randolph Fox, the action which they launched was the beginning of the end of British colonialism in the Bahamas. White supremacy this is Fox's words, white supremacy and racial discrimination had begun to end. My emphasis. In Clifford Darling's words, little did I know on that Sunday morning in January of 1958 that the stunning and unexpected aftermath of the general strike would pave the way for the turbulent decade of the 60s, leading, of course, ultimately to the arrival of a progressive Liberal Party in power, ultimately leading to the freedom of majority rule for all Bahamians. Now, having said that, ladies and gentlemen, I've set the stage. We see the history. The issues were economic. The challenges were that a minority was not listening. 60 plus years later, we see that the challenges are the same. The issues are economic. The resistance is that the status quo does not wish to hear nothing. Nobody move, as far as they're concerned, nobody get hurt. You keep your mouth shut, you sit small, and you take what we give you. The racial composition of this dynamic is completely different, but the resistance to listening to the concerns of working people seem to be the same. Clifford Darling's words continue. He referred to the aftermath of the strike was transformational. It was transformational. Nassau began to change. The following year saw the abolition of the company vote. We know what that was. The company vote was a vote which allowed you to vote in multiple parts of the Bahamas once you had a company or a piece of property in that particular part of the community. That's essentially what buttressed and reinforced white minority rule. Because the numbers were so small, they found the means by which that they could maintain control, and that was by using the company vote and the so-called property vote. According to the government annual report of that year, the transition from threatened violence and unrest to tranquility and prosperity had a lot to do with the changes, the momentous changes which began to take place soon after the general strike. Now, these events are important because it also shows the power of labor when labor is serious. Now, many of you out there do not like that. Many of you out there have this attitude that trade unions are no longer useful in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. I would not be sitting in this chair. I would not be a barrister. I would not be who I am today were it not for those events of 1958, the great events of 1962 with the widening of the suffrage, the great events of 1967 and 1968 were it not for the labor movement. That is who I am. That is who we are. White, black, and brown. Chinese, Greek, and Jewish Bahamian. We are all beneficiaries of one of the greatest struggles which took place in this country in 1958. Because but for that, we would still be living in a society where men thought that they could rule because of the color of their skin. But what's the difference today? It's really difference. Let's continue. Now, all of this is very important, and I'm going to skip now to the very, very end of that introduction. Because we can take a break, and then we'll come back and continue on with this discussion today. Because it's important that I put that into context for you to understand where we are today, where Mr. Dwayne Sands is today, where Ms. Bassett is today. Because it's all part of the same continuum. It's all part of the same continuum. As a result of that labor struggle, the PLP was formed. Whether or not the PLP has carried the legacy of those great moments in time, that is for you to decide. That is for history to decide. But what it did was it facilitated that great change of 1958. A new dynamic in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, which was known as majority rule. One man, one vote. Well, of course, we know in 1962, women also became developed the right to vote. It also was able to facilitate the abolition of the company vote, the abolition of the property vote, all means and mechanisms by which the majority of Bahamians were denied. What are we to do today? Clifford Darling was elected to the PLP ticket in 1967. There you go. He was a loyal PLP until he died. He was appointed Governor General later on in his life. Most of you know that. The events of the general strike unfolded in such a way that notwithstanding your opinion, conservative or progressive, whatever it may be, it led to legitimate demands of a new Bahamas being met. When we come back after the break, we're going to continue with this conversation. I've set the stage. What's next? What is next for labor in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas? And what does 1958, the events of the 1960s, tell us moving forward in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas? So let's take the break right now. Welcome back. Welcome back, Bahama Land. Today, our focus is on the labor movement, the history of that movement, and why it is so important for us today. Now, in 1985, well, let me take it back. In 1973, the promise of a new Bahamas was that Bahamians would be entitled to the so-called square deal. A lot of us don't like to talk about race, but essentially it meant that black Bahamians and white Bahamians would now be able to enter into a new world where your race ought not to matter in terms of advancing your needs and you getting access. You getting access to the rights and privileges that a new Bahamas are wrought. By our Constitution, Article 52 makes it very, very clear that the mandate, the sole and the most important mandate that politicians and parliamentary officers or parliamentarians have is the peace, order, and good governance of the Bahamas. It's not the peace, order, and good governance of the Bahamas for politicians. It's peace, order, and good governance for you, for me, for your children, for your children's children, etc., etc. After independence, there's no question that the project to build a new Bahamas was real. And there's no question, notwithstanding your feeling about the PLP today. Remember now, I'm not talking about today's PLP. Please do not mix that up. Notwithstanding your feeling today that the mandate and the mission which was launched by a young Pinling and a young A.D. Hanna was admirable. There's no question about that. And that a new dispensation was actually crafted against the anvil of social struggle and change. There's no question that a social safety net, second to none, comparable with most in the Caribbean, was established for Bahamians. There's no question that the Industrial Relations Act came into force and made it possible for working Bahamians to enjoy the same dignity of work that others had enjoyed. So that which took place in 1958 had a direct connection to that which was going on in 1971 or thereabouts. The Industrial Relations Act. There's no question that all those things took place. Absent the question of race, there's no question that the economic highlands of the Bahamas were, to some extent, are largely enjoyed by the people of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Now, as we moved on, some things started to happen. In the late 1980s to the beginning of the 1990s, the Soviet Union, the great empire that was the Soviet Union, dissipated. It retreated. This is important, ladies and gentlemen, for you to understand the history. The great history of the world began to be rewritten again. Because up until that point, the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, to a large extent, allowed space for experimentations with the way in which many societies were to be governed, and the economic policies which were important to govern them, and the labor practices which were important to govern them. So, for example, the new international economic order was a big part of the so-called movement of the third world countries, the southern countries of the world, to carve out a space for their economies to advance and to do well. And somewhere in all of that, the Bahamas fared well. We became one of the most successful little countries in the world in the field of tourism. Second to none. A lot of people like to say that this was the Stafford Sands economy. In my view, I humbly suggest that's pure nonsense. The reality is that once Cuba closed, they had to find a space to make money. The Bahamas was there. And we began to follow and practice a set of economic principles which were known as Bahamianization. And I always come back to this question. Every time people hear me speak, they always see me talk about Bahamianization. And it's important that when we talk about Bahamianization, we speak about Bahamianization from the point of view of what it meant. It meant that Bahamians should be first, amongst equals. It meant that Bahamian workers should be given their fair due. It meant that any opportunities which were to come to this country should all benefit the Bahamian people before it benefited anyone else. It's as simple as that. We unashamedly touted Bahamians first. At some point, between the late 1970s, mid to late 1980s, something happened. The demise of the Soviet Union, their retreat, the hegemonic dominance of the American government, its advance, the emergence of people like Milton Friedman and his experimenting with certain ideas which talked about putting things first over people. Local politicians in that context began to lose their way. They began to embrace a new set of politics which, in my view, were not good for the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. That is to say, they began to embrace the idea that that pulling or the cutting back on social services, that the retreat which comes from putting foreign direct investment first, the abolition or the abandonment completely of Bahamianization, all of those things would result in a Bahamas which supposedly was to be more efficient, which supposedly was to be more representative and also meet the needs of our people. This is where the change of direction took place in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. This is what caused the difficulties that Labour was to experience in or about the 1990s or thereabouts, moving into 2000 and into the new century. Because somewhere in that mix, the idea emerged that Bahamianization was no longer important. And if Bahamianization was no longer important, then the Labour movement was no longer important. This happened in the 1980s, 1990s. For those of you who are economists or political economists, I would be happy to have this debate with you, to have this conversation with you. Because when you look at those faces behind me, to my right, Mr. Sands there, and of course the leader of the leader of the union, Dr. Bassett, how we got here to a large extent was fashioned and fostered by what we did in the late 1980s, 1990s. Because the majority, because the dream which was fashioned by a PLP victory was forgotten. Politicians who were revolutionaries soon became part of a new oligarchy. There's no question that there was a new emergence of what I would call Blay Street, B-L-A-Y Street. The black emerging elite, along with Bay Street and its establishment among oligarchs. There's no question that this has happened in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. No one disputes that anymore. The only question is to what extent has it caused a reversal of the gains of majority rule, resulting today in the great clashes which we're now seeing taking place in our Bahama land. The Employment Act of 2000, I should say, also played a large role in this development. Because to a large extent, certain labor leaders are prepared to argue that it prioritized over the concerns of working people, business as opposed to people. Now, I've not studied it. There's a great deal of need for Bahamians to study these particular areas so that when they opine about these type things, they'll be a lot more reliable in what they say. But the doctor's strike today is about what we did yesterday. The doctor's strike today, the BPSU is about what we did yesterday. Because in that particular period of time, from about the 1980s or to about 2000 thereabouts, we embraced a set of economic ideas which were alien to our experience. Alien to our experience. That is to say, we adopted a set of, I've referred to it before on the show. I'm not going to refer to it again. I'm going to simply ask you now, the guys, to start reading. A set of economic ideas which said that the state, Bahamianization, Article 52 of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, was not more important than the foreign direct investment by any means. We started to prostitute the best of us, the best in us, for a drop in the bucket. It meant, therefore, that we had to limit the demands of labor. It meant, therefore, that we had to begin to use the so-called labor injunction to stop unions from going to the streets and doing things like agitating for better rights. There's no question that the labor injunction has become the mechanism or the chosen mechanism to stop certain unions who follow that particular path. But what do I mean? Under the Industrial Relations Act, under the employment legislation, once a grievance is filed, a union has within a period of time a right to strike, a right to take its grievance to that level. The mechanisms which must first be passed, the so-called strike vote, overseen by management, etc., etc., etc. These are some of the things which, in fact, we must pass through before the right to strike can actually be acted upon. That is what we are now facing in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. A trade union movement that has been defined to a large extent. A trade union movement which now finds itself having to go through, having to submit itself to discussion rather than taking the action that it needs to take. Because when we look closely at what the doctors are agitating for, most of their demands are just, entirely just. Most of their demands have to do with working people being able to demand a right to a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. Classic examples of some of the issues which in fact have become very important are issues like whether or not they get paid double time or time and a half for holiday work. Whether or not some of them are being forced to move from the public service as full-time employees to contracted employees and so forth. These are the things that we really have to concern ourselves with. So a complete and total abandonment of the ideals of Bahamianization, of the ideals of majority rule, have gotten us here today. And this is where the doctors find themselves, whether they like it or not. This is where they find themselves. And we're going to spend a lot more time in dealing with that. Now, for a long time, next point, for a long time, we've been trying to decide how to put into context the role played by subsequent governments, many governments over these years. And when I say we, I'm speaking about myself, we on this show. Because we don't want to be accused of being partisan in this way. It's not really a PLP problem, so it's not really a PLP burden, an F&M burden, but we can't blame the DNA because they never had no power, or whomever else. Because it is clearly a national burden. That the trade union movement is such that it finds itself having to threaten the government to get things done. When promises are being made between an employer and an employee, those promises ought to be honored. In this instance, it appears as if this particular employer, the government, has decided to renege on multiple promises. Unions are not perfect, but the government seems to be fair, I should say equal, in the extent and the means to which they seem to want to go to deny working Bahamians their rights. And this has no political color, because the FM and the PLP are equally responsible for state of affairs. There's no question that the firing of hundreds of Bahamians from Bahama at one point, not Bahama, sorry, from Atlantis at one point, and otherwise from Sandy's, yes, on Cable Beach. All of these things indicate to a large extent the weakness of labor to actually take a firm stand in advancing its claim. When a just award has been made against an employer, to this very day, workers at Sandals, former employees, are still waiting for compensation in that regard. Labor is under attack. That's the purpose of part of the purpose for which we're having this show today. Labor is under attack. So when the doctors call, we must answer. When the doctors demand, we must see the sense of it all. It's not just about pay. I like that. It's not just about pay. Now, we have an even more interesting part to the second show, which we're going to do on Friday at 11 until 12. And we're going to have in studio a very special guest. And he is going to help you and I to go through the nuts and bolts of this doctor's strike. Why it's so important for us to support them. Why it's so important for labor to be respected in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Because labor made this Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And I think I've shared with you how that was done. Whether they tell you it was made by simply a prayer to the dear Lord, ain't true. People had to get on the street. Because what does the Bible say? Aside from believing, you must also use your powers of discernment, and you must help yourself. Labor got onto the street in the 1950s and the 1960s and made just demands. That is what crafted our democracy. That is what created Bahamianization. And that is what propelled the newborn nation of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. That cannot just change overnight because we simply do not understand our history. So today, as we break, and we're going to break at this point, I'm going to say to you, support this slot from 11 until 12, if you can. Contact us, 465-0131, and the producer will give me the other contact for you. Because the work and information you will get on this show will be key to understanding what's really going on in your country. Because I'm going to tell you the truth. We also look forward to persons who are prepared to contribute to this effort. Now, we are not going to be controlled by the corporate media. We're not going to be controlled by the corporate media. And we're not going to be controlled by ZNS. So it's safe to assume that when your opinion is expressed on this particular show with myself, please understand it's going to be an expression which is untrammeled and fearless and speaks power to truth. Or truth to power, I should say. 451-5468, that's our studio number. We also invite you to any comments on Facebook. We'll be happy to respond to as the show is going on. We appreciate Otis Charles Bodie. We know that Brother Bodie did in fact post our first show on Facebook to other sites, and we appreciate that. So any commentary you have, we look forward to you stepping forward and taking part. And we of course invite at various points we'll be inviting persons to come in and join our show. My contact number for the show would be 465-0131. And of course, you've gotten the other number, which helps you to reach out to us. Today, that's going to be it. We're going to have a very brief and quick show today. I want to set the stage. A complete reversal of the affairs of the Bahamian people have taken place unless Bahamians fight. Mr. Douglas said that, power does not respond unless there's a fight. Power does not respond to anything except a demand. Power only responds when it sees that there's a force on the other side. God bless and keep safe the Commonwealth of the Bahamas.